Welcome back, zoology students. Miss Saxon again, here to talk to you about cnidarians, which are more evolved than sponges. So there are certain characteristics that all cnidarians have in common. One is that they're soft-bodied, so they're kind of a little squishy. They're carnivorous animals, and they have stinging tentacles that are arranged in circles around their mouth in a radially symmetric way. They are the simplest animal to have body symmetry and to have specialized tissues. Remember when we talked about sponges, there was no body symmetry. It was asymmetrical. Well, now we have radial symmetry, and we see these cells coming together to form specialized tissues. One of the specialized cells that cnidarians have are cnidocytes. These are stinging cells. They're located along the tentacles, and they're used for defense and to capture prey. This is different than like an octopus tentacle. They don't have the ability to sting, so these cnidocytes are unique to cnidarians. Within each cnidocyte, there's a nematocyst, and the nematocyst is a poison-filled stinging structure that contains a highly coiled dart. So when it's stimulated, the nematocyst comes out of the cnidocyte and stings the organism that it wants to eat. Or, if it's a jellyfish and it's stinging you, well, then you're the thing that's getting stung. So as I just mentioned, the cnidarians are radially symmetrical. They have a mouth that's located in the middle, and it's surrounded by tentacles, and these tentacles extend outward from the body. Cnidarians typically have a life cycle that includes two very different looking stages. One of those stages is the polyp stage. It's a cylindrical body with arm-like tentacles. In the polyp, the mouth points upward, and polyps are typically sessile, so that means that they're planted on the ground or the floor of the ocean and they can't move. We typically see this with like sea anemone. A medusa, however, is very mobile. It can move around. It has a bell-shaped body with the mouth on the bottom, and this is what we typically think of when we think of jellyfish. While cnidarians have specialized cells and specialized tissues, they don't have organs. They're only a few cell layers thick, and they have very simple body systems. For instance, they have a gastrodermis, and this is the inner lining of the gastrovascular cavity, and that's where digestion takes place. They have an epidermis, which is the outer layer of cells, and they have the mesoglia. It's a layer that's in between the two tissues. It's in between the epidermis and the gastrodermis. And it can be very thin and non-cellular, or it could be very thick and jelly-like, like you see in jellyfish. It's the squishy part of the jellyfish. That's the mesoglia. All right, so I just want to show you some pictures to demonstrate exactly what I was just talking about. So over here we have a polyp, and it's attached to the ground, the ocean floor. It's sessile, so it's going to attach there. And then you'll see right up here is the mouth, and you can see how that mouth is facing upwards. And around it are these tentacles, and those tentacles are able to sting. And if it's something here, it'll sting it here and then help push the food into the mouth. Inside this area here, that's the gastrovascular cavity. That's where it's going to do its digestion. And notice how thin the mesoglia is here. Not very thick, not very jelly-like. Now, on the other hand, the second body plan is that medusa. And so you can see they all have the same parts. Here's that mouth, and it's got tentacles around the mouth where it can sting and then bring the food into the mouth. And again, this yellow part here is that gastrovascular cavity where digestion will take place. But notice here, this mesoglia part, that's the squishy part of the jellyfish. That's the part that's actually safe for you to touch and kind of squish, squish. Even when a jellyfish is dead, you don't want to touch the tentacles because they could still sting you. But that mesoglia part, that's the part that gives the jellyfish its name for being jelly. So when cnidarians eat, they first paralyze the prey using the cnidocyte and the nematocyst, and then it pulls the prey into the mouth, and once it gets past the mouth, it goes into the gastrovascular cavity. The gastrovascular cavity is a digestive chamber. It only has one opening, so food comes in through the mouth and waste goes out through the mouth. So that's very different from what you're used to seeing in more evolved animals. Partially digested food can then be absorbed through the gastroderm and digestion is completed intracellularly. So the cells of the gastroderm are what actually do the digesting for the specific nutrients. Any materials that cannot be digested are again passed out of the body, and it has to pass through the mouth. They don't have an anus. Since cnidarians are relatively primitive creatures, they are very simple in how they get the materials that they need that isn't food. So when it comes to taking in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide, those things are done through diffusion. Getting rid of waste, cellular waste, can be done through diffusion. And circulating nutrients also is done through diffusion. Cnidarians respire and they eliminate waste through the diffusion through their body walls. So here's an adaptation that cnidarians have that sponges didn't. They do have a nerve net, and that nerve net allows them to respond to stimuli. The nerve net is a loosely organized network of nerve cells. So it's not like a brain, but it's the beginning of what will eventually become a brain. So we have these specialized cells that can detect stimuli, specifically touch. So if the cnidarian detects that there's touch, then it can try to sting and eat whatever it just touched. And that's why sometimes a jellyfish, while it can't digest you, will try. Once it stings you, it'll try to eat you, but you're way too big. So it just leaves you with a sting that hurts incredibly bad, but it doesn't feed the jellyfish. So it's a lose-lose situation there. However, don't ever pee on a jellyfish sting. That is complete myth, and it doesn't work, so don't do it. Cnidarians are able to reproduce both sexually and asexually, so let's start with the asexual side. Polyps can reproduce asexually by budding, just like we saw in sponges. The new animal is genetically identical to the parent animal. One type of budding begins with a swelling on the side of an existing polyp, and it grows into a new polyp. That polyp drops off and forms a whole new polyp. In another type of budding, polyps produce tiny medusas, and those tiny medusas separate and become new individuals that can swim/float away. Cnidarians can also reproduce sexually. The sexual reproduction takes place with external fertilization in the water. So there are separate sexes. Each individual is either male or female. The female would release her eggs into the water, and the male would release his sperm into the water in the hopes that at some point sperm and egg would meet. And once the sperm and egg meets, we have a zygote. That zygote would be able to swim freely as a larva until it attaches to a hard surface and develops into a polyp. Then that polyp would bud and either create more polyps or create more medusas, depending on the life cycle. Don't worry, you're going to see a picture in a sec. So these three diagrams are all going to show you the exact same thing that I was just talking about, especially when we go from polyp to medusa and back. So here, they all show the exact same thing, but I'm going to start with this one up in the upper left-hand corner. So you can see this here is a portion of a polyp, and that polyp could break off and go down and form another polyp, and that would be an asexual reproduction. You can also see that it's capable of making medusas, and that medusa gets released into the water. And there's your little jellyfish. And that medusa, some will release sperm and some will release eggs, and they meet up in the water. That fertilized egg, that zygote, that free swimming larva is called a planula, and that planula typically comes back and forms new polyps. The advantage of this is we've now created, when we combine sperm from a medusa and egg from a medusa into a new organism, we get more genetic diversity. Before, when we saw this polyp create a new polyp or this polyp create a medusa, we're not increasing the genetic diversity. So that's going to have negative impacts on the survival of cnidarians. This advantage here of creating these genetically diverse planula larvae increases their survivability. All three of these diagrams are showing you essentially the same exact thing. They're doing it in a different way. So you may want to pause now and really understand what these diagrams are showing you. So we're talking about the phylum of Cnidarians, and we're going to get a little more specific and talk about 3 classes of Cnidarians. There are more, but these are the big ones that we're going to focus on. The first class that we're going to talk about is the one we most commonly think of when we think of Cnidarians. It's Scyphosa, and these are your jellyfish. They live primarily as medusas. They reproduce sexually, and they do have a polyp form for jellyfish that's restricted to a small larval state with no elaborate polyp colonies ever forming. The purpose of the polyp in this instant is to produce more medusas quickly. Next is Hydrosa. These are hydra and other water-related animals. They are polyps that typically grow together in colonies. Within the colony, polyps are specialized to perform different functions. So it's almost like the individual ones take on a role within the community. Most of these polyps are going to exist in fresh water, hydra being the most common one that we see. Hydra differ from other Cnidarians because they completely lack a medusa stage. They only reproduce asexually, polyps budding into new polyps. Sometimes they will reproduce sexually, producing sperm and eggs in the body wall, but the vast majority are going to be reproduced asexually. And the last class that we're going to talk about is the Anthozoa. These are your sea anemone and coral. These animals have a polyp stage for most of their life cycle. These are where we're finally going to get our first dissection when we dissect those sea anemones. They have that central body surrounded by tentacles. Oftentimes they're referred to as a flower animal. People often mistake both coral and sea anemone for plants, but they're not. They're actually animals. They're part of this Cnidarian phyla. Sea anemones tend to be solitary polyps that will live at any different depth within the ocean as long as they can feed. Coral, however, are not solitary at all. They live in colonies. Their polyps grow together in large numbers, and as their polyps grow, they also produce what's known as the coral reef, which is kind of like a rock-like structure for them to hide in if they need to. We'll talk a little bit more about the unique characteristics of coral reefs in the next presentation. Typically, Anthozoa reproduce sexually by producing eggs and sperm that are released into the water. The zygote floats around. It has cilia, allowing it to somewhat swim, and it will float around until it becomes a new polyp and it becomes attached to the ground. Some species can also reproduce asexually by budding or splitting into 2 halves, but oftentimes we see these guys reproducing sexually. To make that human connection, we're going to look at the importance of Cnidarians to humans. One obviously negative is going to be that when you're swimming, you get stung by a jellyfish. That's really uncomfortable. Also, jellyfish can clog fishing nets, which is going to be unfortunate because you're trying to catch fish. And let's be real, nobody wants to eat jellyfish. There's nothing really to it. They also some of them contain biomedical compounds that have anti-carcinogenic properties. So we're testing some of the compounds that they make to see if we can use them as cancer treatment drugs. Some people like to collect Cnidarians, especially coral, to either make them into jewelry or just pretty decoration for their home, little tchotchkes. And one of the biggest importance, especially for coral and sea anemone, is that they provide homes for other animals. You all saw Finding Nemo, and Nemo lived in a sea anemone. It provided a home for it. It's a symbiotic relationship that is very unique for especially coral reefs and sea anemones. And it's really kind of fascinating to see. But we'll talk a little bit more about the corals soon.